topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Welcome to the Ask the Expert show on W4CY Radio and Talk4 TV, where we bring you educational information from top local experts in the fields of legal, health, financial, and home improvement. Now sit back and listen to experts in family law, association law, hearing loss, business brokers, home care, along with many other topics. Now here are your hosts, Steve-O and Sophia.
Hey, good afternoon. Welcome to another Ask the Expert show where we bring you the top experts in the field of legal, health, financial, and home improvement. You know, we try to cover the entire gamut. And about 8-9 months ago, we got emails saying, how come you don't do a show on asbestos, mesothelioma? And I just never really tried, but there are people out there that really want to know about this topic, and we found one of the top attorneys in the United States with Michael Mandelbrot, and I'm so glad we have him. Hey, Michael, how you doing?
Always great to be here, Steve. I really appreciate being back. Thank you so much for having me. Ready to go.
We actually had 3 or 4 emails last month wanting to know when your next show was going to be. We ran a replay last month, but they wanted to know, so you're already starting to get a following on here. And I got to tell you, Michael, this is a subject that I wanted to make sure that we had the perfect attorney for this. And you know this area of law better than any attorney. You won't admit that, but I can say that. First of all, tell people about your firm.
Well, first off, I appreciate that. The name of my office is the Mandelbrot Law Firm. We do business as the Asbestos Legal Center. This is the entire focus of my practice and has been for the last 30 years. What we do is we represent victims of asbestos-related diseases and cancers. I'm sure we will talk about mesothelioma extensively later on in the show, but mesothelioma is an asbestos-related disease and cancer, is a asbestos-related cancer, which I'm sure many of the listeners have seen the commercials on TV. We also represent victims of lung cancer, asbestosis, and other cancers caused by exposure to asbestos. Asbestos, as you know, Steve, was a product or it was a mineral, a fiber that was mixed into hundreds of products, primarily because it was a great insulator. And pretty much anybody who worked in a shipyard, power plant, a construction site, or a refinery prior to 1980 was exposed to asbestos. Thankfully, not everybody who was exposed gets sick. Those who do, we hope to represent them.
Michael, can you name some of the ports across the United States that this might affect?
I'm sorry, one more time, Steve.
Some of the ports, like maybe.
Oh, of course.
You're in Galveston. I mean, you're in Los Angeles, or you're in San Francisco. So you got the Bay Area there. But what other areas of the United States have you seen this affecting?
Well, we see hundreds and hundreds of cases out of the Naval Shipyard. So we've got Mare Island Naval Shipyard in Vallejo, California, which is very close to my office. We've represented lots of people there. You've got Hunters Point Naval Shipyard, which was in San Francisco or South San Francisco. And then you've got the other naval shipyards across the country, which would include Jacksonville Naval Shipyard, Boston Naval Shipyard, Newport News in Virginia Naval Shipyard. In Texas, of course, there was a number of shipyards. I don't recall if there was a naval shipyard, but I know there was Brown Shipyard and Galveston Shipyard and a variety of other shipyards. Typically, where you, of course, have coastlines, you're going to have shipyards. The primary naval shipyards, as I mentioned, on the East Coast, Boston, also in Maine as well, there was a naval shipyard where they built submarines as well. So I think I've covered a few of them. But
what about San Diego?
Oh, of course.
Yes.
And still to this day, it's one of the few that are still open. San Diego Naval Shipyard. Yeah, Mare Island, close to me, that one closed maybe 20 years ago. Hunters Point, no longer a naval shipyard either. So, but San Diego on the West Coast, yes. And it's not just the naval shipyards, I will say. It includes other military bases as well. Air Force bases, for example. A lot of the hangars had a lot of insulation and a lot of asbestos in them, as well as the planes. Every military facility, barracks, that were built before 1970, all of those had asbestos in them. So really anybody who was in the military has the potential for exposure, but more so the Navy than other branches of the service. Coast Guard, definitely.
We read about mesothelioma. What is it?
Great question. The primary mesothelioma that we see and that we hear about is what's known as pleural mesothelioma. That is cancer to the lining of the lung, not the lung itself. What makes that cancer so insidious and so severe is, one, it is an incurable cancer. Two, life expectancy once you're diagnosed with mesothelioma is about 6 months typically. And three, this is the most important one from the lawyer's perspective, there's only one known cause of mesothelioma, that cancer, and that is exposure to asbestos. We have seen what's known as peritoneal mesothelioma, which is cancer to the lining of the abdomen, also caused by exposure to asbestos as well. There are some other mesotheliomas that we have seen, cardiac, for example, around the lining of the heart, as well as testicular. Those, the medical science, I do not believe is as clear, but without question, pleural and peritoneal mesothelioma, there really is only one known medical and scientific cause of that disease, and that is exposure to asbestos.
So, Michael, I bring this up to you all the time because in Florida, we discuss this, but we've got so many new listeners and viewers. We had a problem with housing down here in Florida, that they found asbestos in the sheetrock, I think it was.
Sure.
Are we talking the same thing?
We are. We're talking the exact same thing. So that, chances are, that was a building that was built before 1975, when most drywall, but primarily the joint compound used with drywall, so that when you put two pieces of drywall together and a large wall, there's joint compound that is mixed. It's a dry material, typically mixed with water and applied on the seams and then sanded down. that had extensive asbestos in it, maybe 50%, we'll say, asbestos in it. Drywall itself, some of it maybe 2%. Fire-rated drywall for the garages definitely had a higher percentage. And understand, it's percentage by weight typically, and asbestos is very light. So when something is, 30% asbestos, by volume, there's a lot more asbestos, millions and millions of asbestos fibers. So the answer to your question is, we're talking about the exact same thing. And the concern now is that asbestos in those walls friable or dusty, where somebody could breathe it in? And if it is, then it has the potential for disease. So the question becomes, what do we do with these old buildings? Do we encapsulate the asbestos and hope that it's not dusty for the next however long we want to keep this building? Or do we tear the building down and start over? And it's a big problem. Drywall is one of the huge problems, but think about these high rises in any major city built before 1972, steel construction. And once the steel is done, the next thing that went on was asbestos fireproofing on every steel beam. So it's in the ventilation systems, it's in the air conditioning ducts now, and it's on every steel beam. What do you do with these high rises? And it's a big issue, just like they're having in Florida with the drywall, and there's a concern. And truthfully,
people could not sell their houses, Michael. People were getting sick. They couldn't sell their houses because they found asbestos in them. It was really bad.
Right. And it's unfortunate. And now I know, and most real estate contracts and leases require disclosure as to whether or not a property contains asbestos. And there isn't any question that if it does, there is a huge reduction in value of that property, because you've got really two choices, and that is encapsulate it, meaning it's still there, but it's just kind of covered up. It's like putting a patch on a hole. Or you've got to remove it, have it what's known as abated by professionals, which is very expensive. The one that millions and millions and millions of homeowners across the country no doubt have encountered is the popcorn ceilings.
Yes.
Those old popcorn ceilings. Though, throughout the late 60s and into, say, 1978, it was difficult to find a home that didn't have those popcorn ceilings in one form or another. And those popcorn ceilings, which any kid who could jump and touch an 8 or 9 foot ceiling would know, was dusty back in the day. You touched it and dust came down. And so, that's one that I hear about all the time. And I hear about people encapsulating it, putting a huge coating over it. And I hear about people also having to go through the abatement process, which typically means vacating your home for about 2 weeks, having your complete home covered in visqueen or plastic, having it, I don't know what they call it, glove bagged or wet bagged removal and scraped off. And it's a very difficult and an expensive process that a lot of homeowners can't afford. And so it really, really is a tough dilemma for anybody who has those popcorn ceilings or drywall or asbestos ducting or stucco siding on your homes. Those are all potential risks, and it's unfortunate.
We got a text from Manhattan, New York. I'm enjoying your show. Is it possible that when the towers went down, from all the people who were suffering from lung disease, was there asbestos in those walls?
Well, I've got an answer to that question, and I take a deep breath because it raises so many. You just raised a number of issues, Steve. And the answer to your question is billions and billions and billions of asbestos fibers came raining down on New York when those towers came down. And the reason was because, the drywall without question, but the fireproofing. Those were, I believe it was called a monocoat, was a spray fireproofing that was used when the towers were built. And if you look at when those towers were built, they were built in the early 70s, right as asbestos was being basically banned from a number of products. It is my understanding that maybe the first 40 floors of Tower 1 had asbestos fireproofing, and they stopped using it for the upper floors because of the ban. And Tower 2 did not have any asbestos fireproofing. But I will say, and it may be conspiracy theorists, and I'm not putting any credence behind it, but there have been many people who have said that there is a chance that if asbestos was used as the fireproofing for the entire towers, they may not have come down at all. But because it was not used, the steel structure in the upper floors in both buildings basically melted and burned, and we know what the end result was. So there is no question that the answer is yes. There was so much asbestos, and I knew it. I knew it when, these 9/11 workers were digging through there. And they had these paper masks on, but they didn't care because they were looking for bodies.
Right.
But the fact was, every one of them was being exposed to a tremendous amount of lethal asbestos at that time. And as we have seen now, there's been thousands and thousands of 9/11 workers who have been diagnosed with various diseases, including lung cancer and mesothelioma. And thankfully, it is my understanding there is a 9/11 trust fund that is set up specifically for those victims. So I apologize for the long answer.
No,
I should have just said yes, but the answer is yes, and a lot of asbestos, and it really raises so many other issues because it really is amazing. And at one point, Donald Trump, I remember him saying during if they had used asbestos, these towers would have never come down. Whether he's right or not, he's been right about stuff I thought he was wrong about, so I'm not making any opinion on whether he was right or wrong, but there have been many people who have speculated that that's the case.
So I know this happened a long time ago, but I know, remember the singer Donna Summers?
Sure.
I know her sister very well, and I asked her, I said, I know she passed away. How did she pass away? And she said she died of lung disease, and because she was right around 9/11, the buildings. And there was a lot, she wasn't a responder, but there was a lot of people. God, look at the dust that went up. Did you get anybody from there as a client?
Well, I am based in the Bay Area in
Right.
California, so it is unlikely. Generally they would probably go more to my colleagues in New York and Manhattan, and some great lawyers. But you brought up Donna Summer, and when you read online about Donna Summer, it says she died usually of lung disease or lung cancer. But Donna Summer died of mesothelioma. She had the cancer to the lining of the lung. She's one of a number of what we'll call famous people who you may very well know who've died of this disease, but people just don't know it. Probably the most famous, Steve McQueen,
Wow.
would be the most famous. He was in the Navy when he was, a young buck working in the boiler rooms. Merlin Olsen, the big defensive lineman,
Played for the Rams.
Played for the Rams, who then later was also on the TV show. Oh my goodness, I can't think of it. It's not A Family Affair, but I know my wife would know the name, but it was Little House on the Prairie.
Oh, okay.
Little House on the Prairie. Big football Merlin Olsen. He died of mesothelioma. And of course, Donna Summer is another one. And the thing about mesothelioma is when you're exposed to asbestos, you never get sick right away. There's a latency period, typically 15 or 20 years later. And what I suspect happened with Donna Summer is, yes, there is a chance that her exposure being around at 9/11 and anybody in that area, it would contribute to an asbestos disease that they may have developed. But typically someone like Donna Summer, maybe she might have had a family member, like maybe her father, for example, worked in a shipyard, a power plant, a refinery, and she did the laundry when she was a kid, or she helped, or she rode in the car with her father. She would have been exposed to asbestos. There are so many different ways that people can be exposed. There was, in this one, he wasn't a famous baseball player, but he was kind of semi-tangentially related to one. And this one was sort of near and dear to my heart. You mentioned Donna Summer's sister. I was a big baseball fan as a kid growing up. And there was a third baseman for the Baltimore Orioles who, I believe he won an MVP. He won a lot of Gold Gloves, Brooks Robinson.
Yes.
Yeah, sure, a lot of the people remember Brooks Robinson.
Yes.
Well, he was replaced at third base on the Orioles by someone by the name of Doug DeCinces.
I remember him.
DeCinces had probably a good 15, 12-year career with the Orioles and then the Angels. But, you always remembered him as the guy who replaced Brooks Robinson. Well, his nephew happened to go to high school in my county. His name was Chad DeCinces, also Chad Youngflesh. His mom remarried. But his name was Chad DeCinces. And as an 18-year-old, Chad DeCinces worked on his grandfather's job sites, sweeping up drywall, construction materials, which included the asbestos joint compound and drywall. And he did this work as a 19-year-old. Well, when Chad DeCinces was 34 years old, he reached out to my firm because he was diagnosed with mesothelioma. And, that was one of the many cases that, really stuck out to me because he was 34 years old. Most of the victims that we see, are people who had generally longer careers, maybe in the military, shipyards, the unions, for example, maybe working as auto mechanics brakes had asbestos in them as well. And so to see somebody 34 years old, it sort of showed me, and like Donna Summer, who we knew as a singer, it really showed me that, the disease can really hit anybody. It's not just the person who worked 15, 20, 30 years with asbestos daily. It can hit any of us, but thankfully it doesn't. Some people just, unfortunately, their bodies react differently, or you can just say that they got the short straw where you and I got the longer straw, because you're probably about the same age as me, Steve, so that means you were born in a hospital that had asbestos in it.
Oh,
There's
yeah.
a chance that your parents worked in it. You definitely lived in a house at some point in your lifetime that had asbestos in it. And whether there was broken floor tiles, you don't even think about it. You jump up, I would rain the popcorn ceilings down on my brother. You don't think about these things, but the disease can hit anybody, more likely to those who have greater exposure, but it can hit anybody. It can hit Donna Summer, it can hit a 35-year-old Chad Youngflesh, or it can hit the sexiest man alive at the time, Steve McQueen. We just don't know.
Michael, I didn't know where to insert this. You don't know this at all. I want to share with people, and you never know who's listening or watching the show. So, since Michael has started the show, we've had about, I'd say, 8 to 10 phone calls from law firms around the country that specialize in this also. Now, a lot of them, I noticed they had a lot of other areas of law that they also concentrate on, whereas Michael really concentrates on this area. And they all wanted to have a show like Michael's. I did share with you one of them, but when we get these phone calls, there's always a few out there who go, you know what, that person wasn't right, and he's giving bad information. And I got to tell you, every person who's called that's heard your show, Michael, have said you were right on. Some of them said you've got a great reputation. And I was shocked that not one negative thing, because I've been doing this for 15 years. And I'm used to getting phone calls from other law firms around the country that hear the show. But I got to tell you, every attorney said that what you were telling and educating people about was right on, or how good that you've got a great reputation. I thought that was amazing.
Well, Steve, I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. And to be honest, it surprises me. I got to say, in my field, there are, I don't know if maybe the best term is backstabbers. These cases are very, very valuable. And these lawyers are really fighting very hard to get these cases. And that's why, you see these commercials, free book, and these lawyers setting up offices all over the country, even though they really only practice and understand the law in one area of the country. They'll set up all over the country. And I've got to say, my reputation and acting with integrity is the most important thing to me as an attorney. And I have not seen that a lot in my field. And I just continue to just be myself, I guess you can say. And if that separates me from the others, then that's the case. But I really appreciate that. So
why are there so many commercials, Michael?
Great question. And you mentioned some of these other lawyers who contacted you practice in other areas as well. And
yes,
let's face it, and people hear it all the time. Lawyers are in it for the money, which is, I'd like to say, again, for me, it's not the case. I want to help these people, and if my office does well because of it, great. But That's what you hear. And the reason why, no doubt why there is so many of these commercials, is because every mesothelioma case is probably worth at a minimum $2 to $3 million, every single one. So, these lawyers, not me, can spend $40-50 million to advertise these mesothelioma commercials. And if they get 200 cases a year, there's about maybe 2,500 mesothelioma cases a year. And if they get 200 cases, you times that by about 3 million a case, that's $600 million for a $50 million investment. And so why you see so many commercials, even worse, anybody out there who types mesothelioma in their search bar, it is 100 lawyers are going to come up before the Mayo Clinic or before, a very esteemed medical center, because the lawyers have bought up. It's the most expensive search term on the internet. Here again, I am trying to be a little bit different. Well, I also maintain a blog, which I don't think a lot of lawyers do, where I talk a lot about these asbestos trusts and other issues in my field. I've recently also started putting informational videos about asbestos and asbestos disease, and hopefully some marketing as well on TikTok, which I know is very popular right now, primarily amongst a younger demographic, but oftentimes it might be the kids who say, hey, Dad, did you know you're eligible for money because you worked at these refineries and you have this disease. So we'll just have to see how that plays out. But, I compliments, I take them. I'll take every one of them, and I appreciate it, Steve. So thank you very much.
Now, what is someone, if they do not have cancer, how is mesothelioma typically diagnosed?
Okay, well, that's a great question. There is mesothelioma is typically diagnosed through a biopsy, a needle biopsy. Just like it sounds, take a needle, run it through the ribs into the lining of the lung, hoping to get a tissue sample, which a pathologist can then test under a microscope to determine what cellular type or what type of cancer, if any, exists in that tissue. That pathologist will then do a pathology report diagnosing the type of cancer, if any, and if it is mesothelioma at that point, it would be diagnosed by a pathologist through that biopsy. That is, I'd say 98% of the time, how I have seen mesothelioma diagnosed. The problem is, oftentimes, somebody might be 80 years old, 82 years old. They have all the symptoms, fluid in the lungs. There's a very good chance that it is mesothelioma, but in the doctor's opinion, they are not suitable for a biopsy and could not survive a biopsy. So the question becomes, how do you diagnose those people?
Right.
What I have seen in some cases is one of the symptoms that you often see is a fluid, often blood and fluid, building up in the lungs, in that lining of the lungs where the mesothelioma exists. It makes it very difficult for an individual to breathe when that fluid is building up. So what the doctors have to do is drain or tap that fluid. Sometimes in that fluid sample, cytopathology they call it, there might be a tissue sample in the blood in that fluid that comes out of the lungs. They can also test it that way. If somebody is not diagnosed through the two ways that I have mentioned, unfortunately, the next way would be a post-mortem autopsy.
Yeah.
And in those cases, what we would typically do is a limited autopsy of the chest cavity only, the lungs, and have the lungs harvested so that the body remains intact as is, and to not hold up any funeral proceedings. But typically it's a post-mortem autopsy where the lungs need to be harvested almost within 48 hours following death, typically, so that the family can move on with whatever they need to do. So those are the three ways. Now, if somebody does not have cancer and they've had a biopsy, there still is a chance that they have a case. One, in that lung tissue, the doctor might see asbestos fibers actually in the lung tissue. That would be considered pathological asbestosis. If that were the case and the fiber count were up to a certain level in that tissue, then that would be a diagnosis of an asbestos disease. We would bring a case. We can also order somebody's x-rays, have a radiologist look at the x-rays or the CT scans, a certified radiologist, and they can determine whether or not there is any underlying asbestos disease. That is for non-cancer individuals typically. Those commercials, I will say, that you see on TV, mesothelioma, those firms, that's all they want, mesothelioma cases. But there are so many other victims of asbestos diseases other than mesothelioma: asbestos-related lung cancer, asbestosis, colorectal cancer caused by asbestos, which is so many individuals you hear about getting colon cancer, intestinal cancer, stomach cancer. All of those, asbestos could have contributed to the cancer. We'll represent those people. We will help those people just as if they had mesothelioma. To us, they are still a victim who is entitled to compensation, and we want to help them. Those other guys you see on TV, all they want is the mesothelioma cases. That's their goal. But we like, as I said, we like to think we're different. We'll help anybody with an asbestos disease.
Michael, you know what it is? You've got a heart for this. And it's so obvious how you really do care about people. When someone, is there any kind of treatment at all for mesothelioma?
I say no, but I've got a client who I'm going to tell you about. His name is Vito Mirabile. And Vito Mirabile lives in San Diego, and he was diagnosed with mesothelioma now about 4 years ago. And when he was diagnosed, he said, I'm going to read everything I can. I'm going to change my diet. I'm going to try every experimental treatment that I can. And UC San Diego happens to have various clinical trials for mesothelioma patients. He was living in Sacramento at the time. He moved down to San Diego specifically because of these. And when I say there is really no cure, there is no cure. He's not cured. But before I met Vito Mirabile, in my opinion, and again, I'm not a doctor, But I thought all the treatment that people would get for mesothelioma was typically either not worth it or a bunch of BS. Because typically the treatment involves such a severe surgery where an individual's lung was effectively peeled like an orange, that even if they survived that surgery, their life expectancy was only extended by 6 to 9 months. And can you imagine what those 6 to 9 months were like after that surgery, after they had been cut open? And so to me, or there was just try the chemotherapy and radiation and it'll shrink it and it'll slow the growth and come back in 6 months and we'll take. And I've seen it for 30 years. Every time it doesn't work. They've never, ever worked. But Vito Mirabile, and we talk about it every time we talk. We have got to write a book, Vito, because you're a 1 in a million. And I said the title of your book is going to be I Survived Mesothelioma. Here's how I did it. And Vito Mirabile changed his diet to make sure that, one, nothing artificial, nothing that could cause cancer to grow, sugar, things like that would go into his system. 2, experimental treatments. He read up and researched every experimental treatment that he could find. And he took all of his settlement money, and we're talking hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars in settlement money. And he's had to pay for all of these treatments out of his pocket because he sees hope and he sees survival. And I don't know how he has done it. I don't know how Vito is still alive. I love hearing his voice. We talk about once a week. And so the long answer to your question is no. But can you survive mesothelioma? Vito Mirabile gives me the hope that the answer is yes.
Wow. You said he's been paying for this out of his pocket. Does insurance not cover this at all?
No. Unfortunately for him, a lot of these experimental treatments and clinical trials are not going to be covered by insurance. And because of the nature of mesothelioma, they might pay for the chemotherapy and the radiation, which he has had some, but not the typical type of that. They're not going to pay for it. So when I talk to him, he'll say to me, I've got to go in for a 2-hour treatment and it's $15,000 just for that one treatment. And he may have 6 of those in that cycle. And then he's got another one, maybe a year later, a different clinical trial. But the fact that he, really is diligent in pursuing his will to live and actively wanting to be involved in these clinical trials and believing that he is going to be alive tomorrow, it has really kept him going. And so, yeah.
Michael,
there was a cure. There's just not a treatment.
He's already got a fan club. We've got 2 texts from people listening going, how come you don't bring him on next time?
You know what? Maybe
that
we
would be
will.
Great.
Yeah. You know what? I'm going to talk to him about it. I'm going to let him know that
he can do it right from his house.
He can do it from his house?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Yeah, he's savvy on the computer. We'll be able to do it.
God, they've already had 2 people wrote that are listening going, bring Vito on.
I will. He would love it. He would love it. You know,
I think people need to hear something positive about this.
You know, it's funny because I had another client who lived in San Diego. His name was Nick Marcher, and he has passed away. And he had already sort of started the traditional treatment, but I put the two of them together. And, you know, they became friends, and it really gave Nick hope, you know, late in his life as well. It gave him some hope. But Vito is happy to help others in the same predicament, happy to talk to people and happy to share his experiences. And don't get me wrong, he's a guy who's rough around the edges, but
that's okay.
You know, he's got a heart. Yeah. He's got a
let me, you know what? There's people who are listening to the show right now going, how do I know maybe I have that? How would someone know?
Great question, you know, and I ask my clients, you know, how did you find out? You know? And what they usually say is, you know, they'll notice either breathing, you know, ongoing breathing problems, and they go to the doctor and the doctor says, oh, it's just bronchitis, and they give them something and it doesn't go away. Or, you know, and then it continues to happen and they say, well, I want further tests. And then they say, well, maybe it's pneumonia, and they give them more medication and it doesn't go away. At some point, you've got to ask your doctor for a chest x-ray. And the problem is also that chest x-ray is not going to be read by somebody who's trained in looking for asbestos-related diseases. It's going to be read by whatever the radiologist is on call at the office at the hospital that day. So, you know, you may want to ask them, hey, do you look for asbestos-related diseases when, you know, they take that x-ray or they take that CT scan? We always, you know, send them to the doctor and review them for clients for free. They can send them to us. We'll send them to the doctor. We'll pay the bill. And we'll tell you whether or not you've got it. But that's the thing. You don't really know until you get some tests done. The symptoms, breathing problems, pain in the side, ongoing pain in the abdomen, things that typically don't go away. More severe cases, of course, we have seen, you know, where you'll see an actual growth or like a tumor. You know, coming out of the side right here, a little bump, you know, coming out of the side. Those are some of the more severe cases. And those are, I have to say, usually people who are thinner. You can see it because more people who carry more weight, you won't see it outside. So, but it's the ongoing pain, shortness of breath. That's the number one. Shortness of breath. That's the thing. And then ongoing
Michael,
pain,
how do people get a hold of you? We've got about a minute left.
Steve, thank you. 1-800-970-DUST. Direct line is 415-895 5175 to my office. And I also want to give out my cell phone for the listeners. You can call me directly on my cell phone, 415-307-2119. You can call or text me there anytime with questions. I'm happy to speak with you. If I'm unavailable, I will call you right back. My office, mesothelioma.pro. You can find me
Michael, we are so blessed to have you. I never knew a show like this. There was so much information. Michael will be back again with us next month, and hopefully maybe with Vito also.
I appreciate it. All right, let's do it. I'll talk to him.
Buddy.
Thanks again, Steve.
Thank you. We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you.
That's Michael Mandelbrot. He is amazing. That's it for us today. We'll be back again with you next week with more Ask the Experts.
Thanks for tuning in today to the Ask the Expert show on W4CY Radio and Talk4 TV. Tune in next week and every week to hear more from our experts on personal injury, insurance, air condition repairs, estate planning, Medicare, and many other topics in the areas of legal, health, financial, and home improvement. See you next week.